Sing on. Alright. Well, oh, yes, the lights are out. It's night now. And with night comes its own little lessons, so let's have our lesson of the evening. Ran out of cigarettes. I go to the store. Uneventful walk. Uh, nothing exciting until the last like few moments. Um, I'm background. I'm in Austin, Texas. I live on the south side of the river of Austin, just to be as vague as possible. But yeah, we've had homeless issues, people without homes. Uh, it's pretty bad. Uh, it's pretty clear that it's a big problem right now, and I'm reading a lot of people facing evictions, and the problem seems to just be getting bigger. But getting back to the original point, moving across the entrance to the apartments, individual in a black backpack and a dog walked up and like had an image of Fallout, you know, uh, vault dweller, survivor, whichever, with dog meat. Except, he was startled by my presence. So I was like in this interaction, I was the what would you call the enemy, you know. I could have been a scavenger, raider, whatever, a death claw, whatever it might be, some sort of boogeyman in the dark. And then, yeah, I kind of calmed him down. Was like, "No, you're good, man. I was a dark figure at night. You can't see who I am." And that his shock turned into relief, and kind of had like a moment there, obviously. But I don't know. It was an interesting lesson. It was like, what do you learn from fear? Like in those moments, whenever you're the one being inflicted with fear, and then the one that is inflicting the fear. It kind of creates a situation where you want to work with your inner voice. Like what is it telling you in that moment? Like the guy didn't immediately resort to just trying to sick his dog on me, or pulling out a weapon. Probably, I'm not sure of his situation, but if I was walking around in the streets, I'd probably want something to defend myself with. But he didn't resort to that, obviously. Again, it could have just been the shock that had taken him in the moment, and me reacting quickly enough to kind of allay those fears. But then there's the other side of it, and then that's trust. And a lot of people don't realize that, you know, fear and trust are kind of on the opposite spectrums. And trust kind of falls in line with the bubble that is love, I guess. So it's like having that recognition that you can trust somebody in a moment. And I was thinking it would be really nice if the society was more built upon that. That, you weren't startled in the middle of the night when an individual walked up on you, like the hypothetical monster in the night. It would be nice, But again, it's all about the framing of it in your mind. So, like, and all you can really do is be an example in that. You can't really tell anybody, oh, this is what you do when you face somebody at night. You can only really show. There is no telling in those situations. And I think being an example in that's important. But yeah. But yeah, it was a good walk. The weather's still nice. Got a definitive. I'll be moving out on the 12th probably, if nothing else doesn't deter that. I'm just not in a situation to contain this place and maintain it in the way that it needs to. So we can do the old leap of faith, and we'll see what happens. Kind of going back to our previous conversation, making you know nothing into something. um, Observation is kind of on my mind. Um, just kind of make sure you take in what you're seeing, you know. Sometimes seeing things is important. Um, and like observation, again, kind of falling in three categories: seeing, hearing, and knowing. So, you know, if you think about it like that, it helps you kind of be open, you know. Um, what might just delay you might just save you. You know, sometimes taking it slow isn't a bad course of action. Never feel a need to like rush into something. You know, it should feel right. You know, like you're in a situation where, you know, you're up against the wall, sometimes relaxing, accepting the situation, and then following what you feel, what you know, is to be right, is going to be your best course of action. Again, that's just from honing and listening to your inner voice, though. Um, if you want to be able to understand your inner voice, because the thing is it's going to be more in symbols up to a certain point. Um, you're going to want to cultivate your symbols and understand what they mean. Like, here's an example. I had a dream not too long ago about being in the ocean, and there was a pair of lovers with me, and then they were human, you know, just like I was. But then we were in the water swimming with two killer whales, which I think they too were lovers. But the question becomes like, all right, so you're in the middle of an ocean, nothing around you, you know, but you're not worried. You know, you're kind of in the moment, just enjoying it for what it is. So there's like no stress or anything. I'm not worried about getting back to shore in this dream. Like there's a part of me that recognizes it's a dream. So by embracing that, I'm kind of absorbing what's happening. I'm not taking like the fears that could be associated with it. You know, in this case, being stranded in the middle of the ocean or something, and taking it as a bad thing. I'm taking it as it is. Um, and then what does these two people and these two sea creatures mean? And that one took me a little bit. I was stumped on that, but I think it's Gemini and Pisces, the two pairs of the zodiac. And I just thought of that. So, yeah, I'm awesome, I guess. But either way, so you have these two archetypes that are interacting in this setting, which is the sea. And then, well, what does the sea mean? Like, you'll see it repeat as a metaphor for something across like all different spectrums. The idea of a shore, the idea that there's a line you cross, a boundary, you know, between one state, which would be land, into another state, which would be the sea. So you start connecting dots and start thinking about it, and then you're like, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. You know, honestly, nobody can really truly tell you but you. You kind of need to come to those answers on your own accord. It's kind of like playing a single player game, single player video game. You know, you're going through this video game. In order for you to get to the next part in the narrative, you'll either need to complete some gameplay, which will either be supplemented with acquisition of a skill or ability or, you know, tool that will allow you to progress to the next challenge. And more often than not, there's some sort of narrative tied with each conclusion to each of those actions. So that's your breakdown. Like it's everything's event to event, you know, like if you want to break it down mechanically. So losing my train of thought. Oh, 2, 4, 6, 8, 0. So video game as an example. So you're going through this narrative and you're trying to get to each point. You can't get to the end without having gone through each of those points. It's like skipping all the way to the end level, but you don't have any of the abilities, skills, or the tools you need to be able to beat the final boss to get to the last narrative piece. Except in this case, there is really no final boss. It's kind of like a never ending Dragon Ball Z, what's going to happen next week kind of bullshit going on. So, but nonetheless, if you're thinking of your challenges like that, if you're always looking to the end game, you're gonna miss the gameplay opportunities and lessons that are available to you in those situations. So yeah, that kind of goes back to what we were saying about shortcuts before. You skip something, you're bound to miss something. Missing something could be, everything. You never know what has been set into motion, and then for you to have missed that. And again, it's not something to stress about. It's more that you need to pay attention to what your I guess your intuition is telling you, if you want to use that word. But yeah, no, there's a lot of wisdom to be gained from simulations. You can see the value in a simulated video game world uh, if you look at it from a proper perspective. Now, when you're in it, you're too close to the trees to see the trees for the forest. You're just experiencing it. But in my situation, I've been playing them on and off for since I was a child, um, and doing that enough, eventually you kind of gain an understanding of the wisdom that's trying to be conveyed in these simulated ideas. But we used to have something called stories before, where you lived it through your mind, whereas video games are kind of like a cheap attempt of creating a story in its own way. Not saying it's a bad thing, and I'm not saying cheap in a bad way either. What it is that as you try to copy something, the more it loses its original intention. So that makes you question, well, what's the root of stories? And well, that goes to your mind. It all comes back to the mind itself. It's how the mind processes things. And more often than not, these stories were laden with the symbols that we were talking about earlier. And the reason that they're laden that way is because you're trying to, in a lot of ways, trying to speak to that side of yourself that's, almost alien to you. It's in a way not a silent observer that can't communicate with you directly in the ways that you're normally used to. You have to be open in mind and body in certain ways. I'm not saying like you have to have some kind of religious tone, and more of in like, are you able to relax your body to the extent that it's not an obstacle? It's again just certain states that you have to be in, like a certain flow state. I learned it as Mushin whenever I was doing martial arts, and it wasn't even my teacher that taught me that. It was me going off on a Zen Buddhist research rampage at one point, just because I was trying to understand why the warrior aesthetic was mixed with the mystic slash pacifist aspect, at least what I perceived to be pacifist at that time. So you have all these situations happening with these different archetypes kind of communicating. The thing is a lot of times these archetypes kind of take control of the persona because it gets too bought into the illusion of the inner self. That's why if you take a symbol, you can I've come up with a way in saying, okay, so you have your verted, which would be your upright position of a symbol. So that's just like if you're doing tarot or anything like that, runes, it's the upright position. Now, when you move to the right, that's when you start doing inversion. So that's when you start moving inward with the symbols. The symbols start becoming very what do they call it? They become more introspective of your internal processes, I guess. I have a document written on my drive, and there should be a link in down below, or whatever. You can check that. But so the losing train of thought. 2, 4, 6, 8, 0. So you want to take those symbols and recognize what they really are as tools and not entities to rule your life in that sense. You know, like it's very easy to allow things that are a part of you to become all of you when you need to recognize that you're the sum whole of your parts. You know, you're not just one individual part. Think of it as a tool belt. You should be able to use the tool that you need in the moment in that proper situation. So if you're using the wrong tool for the wrong job, you're going to have less efficient results. So always kind of think of it like that. And then sometimes, you know what, the unorthodox use of a tool can leave somebody, you know, surprised. You can provide them with that twist to the drama that you're looking for. You know, like, oh, holy cow. You know, like, oh, there's a mind-eating monster out there that nobody can experience except through proper thought. And once they think about it, it just drives them crazy. Like, how do you fight against something like that? Well, you skirt around the idea until you get a proper idea. You know, like if you recognize what it is that it it responds to, you work around that until you can find a way to create a way to communicate about it that it doesn't know about. And that kind of creates this whole question of why would you have to go to that extent? Well, okay, so let's make a story. Let's do a story real quick. I like making stories. All right, you're the last person that you know that knows of this. We'll call it an alien. That makes it simple. And this alien exists in another dimension that we can't experience. But the thing about it is it's able to think into our world, you know, and then vice versa, we can think back at it. So let's say that this thing's like feeding on people, you know, like, oh no, we don't know why these things are happening. Oh, but who cares, you know, because it's, you know, the world we live in. But you're living in this world and you're trying to figure out, you know, like, oh, you know, I want to get some revenge on this fucker. You know, I'm the last one. You know, nobody else is around that knows it. You know, they weren't able to work around the situation well enough that they didn't contaminate themselves with the subject. You know, so yeah, so here you are, you're all alone, you're trying to figure shit out, and then you finally bingo, you know, like the one day that intuition kind of really just kicks right back in, and you're starting to come up with solutions to problems that you didn't know existed only by the merit of you coming thought to thought, you know, getting little links that are kind of putting things together. So you're trying to figure this out, right? Like, okay, so I know these things and now I'm starting to use these things, and like I'm gonna go ahead and try to do something about it. You know, like what's the best way to do about it? Well, shit, you know, knowledge is power, right? So that's when you start having to come up with ideas to disseminate that information. And I'm like, how are you going to disseminate that information? You know, like you're going to be like setting up a lot of people for your fucking failure, you know? And it's like, well, you got to kind of listen to that inner voice, you know? That inner voice hasn't led you to a situation thus far where it showed you that uh, it wasn't operating in a malintention, you know? So like so far in this story, you know, you're seeing yourself, you're alone against the world, and you're trying to fight an enemy that nobody else believes in, because you know if they did they wouldn't exist anymore in the capacity that would matter, you know. So you've gotten to this point and you're like, shit, you know, things could be worse. I guess you could be dead. And then you start realizing that, you know, the only way that you are going to be able to learn anything is to fuck around and find out, right? That's the question, right? Like, how do you, you know, like maybe you're getting a little tired of being lonely, you know, maybe you're getting a little reckless, little, you know, hey, shake the chains a little bit, uh, see what happens, you know. But, you know, you're not completely reckless. You've got some ideas. You know, this is a mental, you know, thing. So, like, it's a mental game. So, like, what are the rules to a mental game? How do you play a mental game with something that's, you know, so much more immensely bigger than you and could theoretically squash you like a bug? But, you know, in your case, you've been hiding in the shadows well enough as a roach, not, you know, hiding under the shower curtain. Your buddies, you know, they kind of just reached out a little bit and that shoe came out quick. Like, you know, that's, yeah, like, what do you do against something like that? Well, then you realize, well, it's not really that. It's not that metaphor. You know, you're not that roach. You know, you in the metaphor you're making, you're not that roach. You know, you're something else. You're something that you don't fully understand is capable of dealing with something like that on that scale, because there's a lot more going on in the background, and that recognition of that background is where is where the I mean, I guess the meta of the gameplay would be, you know, like, you've learned to play the game of life, but now, like, how do you play the real game? You know, what's the real thing, this thing, you know, that's, you know, again, something that's not being addressed in the main storyline. This is like the secret storyline in the background, you know, the one that everybody's trying to solve, you know. But yeah, it's interesting, you know, and then you see it reverberate across all human culture, and really what it is all just a scream for, hey, how do we deal with this? And then you start seeing that there are other people operating in the same channels. You're like, whoa, wait, I might have some allies out there. But before you do anything, you know, like, you've kind of leaked a little bit of your work out there. Not sure if it's your own intention or you know, like, it's easy to fall into the idea that you want to share your work when maybe the work itself is more important than anything. You know, the audience isn't the primary goal. It's getting the information out in a way that it's in a space that it's manifested in its own way. So yeah, you go about making projects, but you leak them a little here and there, uh, just enough that some people come across it. Maybe one person emails you and asks, "Did you hack my brain?" And you're like, "What?" And like, how are you having that sort of ramification with the work? So then you throw a warning on it so people might understand a little bit better. But then you also realize that the warning might be a little too blatant, so you have to tone it down to make some vagaries about it. Because, you know, like, again, just in the warning, you could potentially be creating a situation where now you're just, you know, feeding people to this monster, this hypothetical, you know, thought monster that exists. So moral ramifications of it and all that jazz. Ugh, I think I need another cigarette. All right, we're gonna go for a little bit on this one. I'm just kind of going with the flow, as they say. Oh, oh, if I could get my hands in my pocket. Doors and corners. Doors and corners. Oh, inside is out. So, uh-oh, I think we just went to landscape. Go back to portrait, thank you. If I move over here into the light a little bit more. Oh, there we go. That's a little better. Oh yeah, this has been John Gilbert, just talking you to sleep. Dr. John Bright. Well, no, wait, Jack, right? I can't remember what he went by. Dr. Bright was mostly it. I know it was J. Either way. How are you doing tonight? You having good night? You're looking for sexy hunk to keep you busy. You did not find him. uh, but yeah. So you're in this video game. Just kind of recapping. You're in this video game, and your whole point is that you're living in this survival simulator, and it's got capitalist overtones in the particular server that you're on. And it seems like all of these different aspects of it are just, you know, tools of this thing. Like, whoa, what? No, no way. It's it's interested in keeping nails at the base of a tree, kind of. It wants to stunt the growth of the collective, if that makes sense. Like the whole group of people that live on this planet. Cattle's great in numbers up to a certain point. Once the cattle starts, getting a little bit feisty with you, getting a little wacky with you, that's a little bit of a different story. But if you're a predator that lives in this kind of world, this mental world, your best course of action is to remain camouflaged. I mean, think about it. Like in every situation where you're tigers, great whites, all these, even killer whales, like they're designed for their environment. So like, how would a mental thought, a mental predator work? I mean, it would most likely work best by pretending it wasn't there. What was that movie? It's like the biggest trick that the devil ever played was making people think that he wasn't there. That sort of mentality. Except I don't operate within that spectrum. I don't see things as like, oh, it's the devil. No, I mean you can use that allegory, but the problem is it already has these certain connotations built to it. And really, the thing about humanity is that it's too often taking a side instead of humanity's side. It's taking the ideas and thoughts that they have as to have more pertinence than the collective whole. Um, like the tribe, in this case, the tribe, explaining, if you're all just one tribe, if you have people that are creating a drag on you by hoarding resources collectively, yeah, that creates a problem, and that wouldn't work in a small scale situation. But in a large scale situation, there's distance. And that's the biggest thing is it's distance and delay. Those two things make it easy for that system persist. So, maybe this thing, feeds on, I don't know, maybe it feeds on negative responses. So, like, it would work in its best interest to influence the system to create the most negative responses in the most amount of people and the least amount of negative responses in the people who have the most power. Does that make sense? So, yeah, great. Your life's great because you have all these resources, and like, how could the world be bad? And you get to make the decisions. Whereas the people who don't have any kind of power in that system, they're the ones that end up suffering. And then, the more what you really start to notice whenever something's got you around the neck and starts to squeeze. And I noticed it a long time ago, and I mean it was shit before Y2K that I knew that. When I was 17, I'd seen it in the world. The world was built as a predator. It's designed to eat. In this game that we're talking about, the simulation. So it's like, well, how do you fight against that? Gradual change, baby steps. You make changes everywhere, and everybody contributes to those changes. Enough you'll see that eventually it's not the same system anymore. Just like you weren't the same body 7 years ago, because all of your cells have died and regrown, grown you up as a new person, essentially. None of you exists anymore there. not in the materialistic perspective. Your quantum field's still there. That's a different story. That's something that is more or less unexplainable in the traditional sense. So we'll leave that for a topic for another day. But so going back, we're in this situation. We're in this hypothetical simulation. You're playing your character. You're playing alone. Backstory's like, sad. You lost all your companions, and now you're in a situation where you want to kill this god, quote unquote, this thing that exists outside of our reality. And we go back to the cockroach metaphor. You recognize one day that, well, you're looking at it in the wrong lens. You've been scurrying from it, like, well, how do you survive that? So then you start inventing stuff, and now you're just like engaging in the gameplay systems, meta systems, and you start realizing that there's like a whole bunch of customization options. You're like, wait, what? We're like, oh shit, look, I can save a copy of my consciousness. I was like, wait, what? How? What? No, it's not like an actual copy. It's like a duplicate. It's like using extra material that you've collected, quote unquote, and contributing that into a skill point tree, I guess, if you want to use that method. I'm probably more partial to like an actual table and picking and choosing like a menu. But then you can start recognizing that, well, what would kill me in my mind, And it's like, well, if my consciousness was where, it thought it was, then that creates a situation where it can eat that consciousness. Well, why don't we use its tactic against it? And we'll kind of revert the playing field, We'll do the old lizard tail thing. Whoa, what's that? Like a lizard loses his tail. Get this lit back up. So you're in this hypothetical game still, and you figured out this thing, and you're like, well, how do I get to use it? Well, the only way you can really use something is if you engage it and test it. In this case, there is no tutorial place you can go to. There is no menu back out of. It's just a online only game. You always have to be on the server. Can't pause it. None of that jazz. So you're in a situation where like the only way you can test it is to put all your cards on the table and just go ahead and play it. Well, quote unquote cards on the table. So you got to think of some redundancies beyond that, just in case it doesn't work. And then you work out all these skill sets, and then you figure out a plan. Well, okay, this is what I would ideally like to have happen. Okay, and then you're gonna invert, revert, and then subvert that plan. You're gonna look at it in those 4 angles. So you want to internalize it, and then, well, am I going to be able to do it? Am I going to be able to actually do this? So that's where the key is, well, do you even believe in yourself enough to be able to do it? Which if you don't have, then you'll need to cultivate that first, You got to go do some power leveling on that skill. So then at that skill, if you check that box, and you're going to move over to the invert, like, well, we already did the invert, so let's go back down to the bottom. Let's do the revert. Okay, so this is where your plan goes wrong. Okay, well then what do? What's your plan B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, all the way to the Z? What's their plans? So you want to make sure that you have contingencies in place. And one of those contingencies should always be the acceptance that, you're going to probably lose your character. It's a good chance. And then the question is well, is the risk versus the reward worth it? So now you're moving into subversion. What happens if I do this? What happens if I do succeed? What could be the ramifications of it? So maybe you figure out, well, it's not that I need to, kill the monster. I need to become friends with the monster, or I need to understand the monster, or maybe the monster has friends and family, and it's just doing what it does, kind of like how a cat chases a mouse. And maybe if the mouse said, say, hey, look, motherfucker, calm down. Maybe it would calm down. I mean, those are always options, right? I think the big interesting thing is that if you were able to communicate that you would like to uh, work work in tandem. Maybe this could be an ally to the collective in whole. Maybe it doesn't have to be a let's kill each other kind of situation, because then that creature starts finding out you're leveling the fuck up. Not only are you leveling the fuck up, but you're getting like some abilities that it can't even wrap its mind around, because it hasn't operated in the prey mentality. It hasn't been put into a situation where like do or die or all. It's just been kind of living a life of luxury by having no resistance. This is the situation where like the fat guy's on the couch, and and the the I guess the like butler, I don't know, servant is like getting pissed and actually being able to do something instead of just being docile and accepting it. But yeah, so I digress. Either way, it's kind of like a mind game. In the way that you can play that, and understanding that, a lot of your obstacles are made, like simple exercise. Like imagining yourself and you're in your room or wherever you're at right now. And in your mind, how do you go from where you're at to your front door? All right. Yeah. So yeah, you kind of just imagine what you'd do physically is what I'm imagining you did. I could be completely wrong, I accept that if that's the case, but nonetheless, you probably imagine yourself going up to your door, opening the door, stepping out the door, walking out the door, walking around. Well, why even walk? Why not just float through the wall? Again, this is in your mind. This isn't a place where the rules that are set are the ones that you believe in. Like physical reality has no bearing on your mental state other than what you decide to take from that physical reality. So yeah, you might see some cool shit in like some video game and be like, oh yeah, what, you can do that in your mind. That's not something that you can't do. It's just a matter of recognizing where it has value. It's not always, fantasy for fantasy's sake, is play, but then there's also fantasy for the sake of work. And then how does that apply? Well, that's when you apply the creative mind and look at what the artist does. You get a different perspective on things in that kind of level, But in that kind of world where the monster is something that you cannot see, you cannot feel, can't touch, it physically doesn't exist, but it does exist on a different level. Um, the answer to those problems are creative resolution. And it's like, well, how do I operate within a bounds of limitations to achieve the goals that I want? And again, like you kind of think of your problems as that monster, and then you start thinking outside of the box. You're like, well, like what do I got to do to get away from, what do I got to do to solve this problem? And you just kind of go back over what we kind of said, again, look at the problem, like what's the solution? And like again, baby steps more often than not. We as human beings have a tendency of chasing the end of the line when we should be chasing the next thread on the line, or the knot. I guess knots. Yeah, that makes a better sense. So like a knotted rope, instead of just trying to pull yourself up from the bottom all the way to the top instantly. You want to grab each knot that's in place for you, because that's the safe path that's been kind of predestined for you, if that makes sense. Like you didn't go out there and make those knots, and you probably didn't hang the rope because you're climbing up it. But again, people contribute to that in their own way. And then by providing other people's solutions to problems that they didn't know that they have, that's where the artist really shines, because they're able to creatively provide those solutions in ways are um, that are trying to talk to that inner part of you. You know, again, how we said way earlier about stories. But yeah, um, the weather's pretty nice right now. Got a little bit of wind coming in, and yeah, I'm thinking that's just reminding me that I'm long-winded, and I'm probably gonna cut this video. But I don't know. We'll call this one "Lessons in the Dark" #1, I guess. I don't know. I am getting kind of tired. But either way, I appreciate you listening to me rant and ramble and get all that creative ideas out in the air. And yeah, hopefully maybe it inspires you to make something, because I think that's one of the most important things right now is that artists continue with their craft and continue giving people things to remind them that their experience is more important than their presence, if that makes sense. But yeah. All right. Well, love you. Bye.